Just in case you guys didn't hear me, we have a 4-minute warning now. 4-minute warning before our last session begins. Hello, everybody. Please find your seats so we can get started with the second half of our habitat and restoration session. First up, we have Reid Camp from Snake River Salmon Recovery Board, and he'll be talking about reconstructing lost rivers.
All right, people. Finish your conversations, have a seat, get started on the next session. Okay. Thank you all for sticking around. I'm actually not going to talk about an Upper Columbia River tributary. I work in the Lower Snake, so I'm going to use an example on the Touchy River, which is a tributary to the Walla Walla. So we think a lot about when we're trying to do process-based restoration, how do we know what to design? And of course, one of the main ways that we do that is try to find reference sites. But a problem with reference sites, of course, is that they really, in this modern landscape, don't exist. So the impacts from human activity are so widespread and rampant that it's really hard to find a site that is still truly intact and devoid of any human impacts. So what we end up doing, of course, is looking upstream in the watershed. Typically, the least impacted areas are in the headwaters. But then that can lead to a lot of misuse of reference sites because there might be a reach type mismatch, or where you're looking has completely different boundary conditions to where you're working. So what I would propose is that we use more of an approach moving forward of what I like to call a fluvial autopsy. And this is not really reinventing anything new or creating anything new. These types of frameworks exist in a lot of ways. But ultimately, it's trying to use multiple lines of evidence to reconstruct a river's past structure and processes. So I have just 3 major categories listed here of different types and some examples below. But this is sort of like a criminal investigation where you're trying to compile as much evidence as you can and see where that evidence leads you with a little bit of process inference and ergodic reasoning along the way. In this talk, I'm going to mainly focus on using LiDAR analysis. There's so much more that would go into this, but the LiDAR analysis is very visual and very helpful for really seeing what I'm trying to talk about. But by going through this process, it can lead us to a target restored condition. Rather than using a reference site elsewhere, we can look at local evidence and figure out where we would go. But first, we need to do a quick little geology refresher, but don't worry, I have some very professional cartoons to go through. This is really kind of specific to the Touchy River in our area in the Lower Snake, but is very reminiscent of a lot of the areas that have been covered up by basalt, so a big majority of the interior Columbia River Basin. The pre-Miocene river valley, 23 million years ago, we don't really know what this looks like, right? But it's an underlayment of tertiary rocks built the foundation for big modern rivers. But that was heavily obscured during the Miocene. CRB flows come in, we get all those big basalt layers, some places kilometers thick, and that completely obscured the ancient river valleys. During that time, we also had uplift, so especially in the Blue Mountains where the Touchy River headwaters start, even sometimes as the basalt flows were coming in, the mountains are uplifting, creating that gradient to allow, during the Pliocene, incision through the CRBs. And this is now really the same bedrock boundary conditions that our modern rivers are working in. And then the next stage, we have the Pleistocene, known as the Ice Age, glaciers everywhere, not necessarily in the Touchy, but certainly an extended cold period that led to a lot of major flooding. We had the cataclysmic floods from Bonneville and Missoula. That is really the main driver for where our alluvial beds started forming, filling up these valleys. And then moving on to the Holocene. Of course, we're still in the Holocene, but it's really this deglaciated period where we had roughly 12,000, 13,000 years where processes were intact and working together between the channel and floodplains. There was some abandonment of those Pleistocene terraces as the river dropped down, but what really kind of made everything look the way it is now is what I'm trying to call the grand unraveling, this 100, 120-year period where the combined effects of all of human activity was compounding and leading to a rapid systemic incision across the entire Northwest. And it's a long range of period, at least in the human timeline, this 120-year period, really coincides with a lot of these, traveling across the West, settlement, heavy resource extraction, then pockets of exponential human growth, population growth, infrastructure development, all of those kinds of things. And what this led to is a drop in the water table, deep incision, and I hear people say, oh, I'm working in an incised river, my stream's incised. It's like, yeah, buddy, all of them are incised pretty much. So this is the state that we're working in, and what we've really done through these human activities is started a new epicycle of erosion. And typically those epicycles end with a big deposition event. But of course, because of all the constraints that humans have put on them, it doesn't allow the river to reach that depositional event, just keeps it in this erosion loop, keeping things static as they are in this really degraded alternative stable state. But what this allows us to do is what I'm going to talk about. That rapid incision, it happened so quickly that it left the footprint of the ancient river, or the historic river, up on the floodplain. And with things like LiDAR, we can start figuring out exactly what these rivers look like and maybe replicate them. So looking at imagery, of course, it can be really hard to see these types of things. This is a pretty good looking, by all accounts, section of the Touchy River. But when you start looking underneath the terrain, underneath the vegetation, and use LiDAR and developing relative elevation models, it exposes what's hidden beneath that. And even in some places on the ground, these features are hard to see. I think people are familiar, so LiDAR, we get digital elevation models, but to create an REM, we're really just removing that downstream valley slope, flattening out all the elevation data relative to the channel. So the beauty of it is it really makes those fluvial and morphological features pop on the landscape, but it also makes this type of analysis much easier. By looking at the different elevation bands in the REM, we can start classifying not just the main channel and the modern floodplain, but we can start looking for those fluvial signatures that would only have existed on the landscape if there was fluvial action, so like margins of the historic or ancient floodplains. And looking across this, just doing different elevation bands, you can see the channel, the modern channel in blue, the modern floodplain in green, the historic floodplain, so this would be the Holocene floodplain that is now a terrace in most cases, and then that brown is that Pleistocene, really ancient terrace that is mostly abandoned. And I think this pulling a cross-section really helps drive this home, that there are consistent elevation bands when you look across laterally in these valleys, where the orange, that modern floodplain, across there is pretty consistent elevation bands of that floodplain, indicating those fluvial features that we can identify. It also points us to this 7 meters roughly of incision in the Touchy River. And you look at the historic channels out on the floodplain there, and they're nowhere near 7 meters incision. So it's highlighting this rapid loss of alluvium through the system. And so we're able to take these same elevation bands, pull out different features in the landscape, and we do this a lot. I see people do this a lot still, of doing that for the current channel. So now why not just replicate the process for the historic channel? So I've got that in green as the historic channel, what was there in the Holocene before the Grand Unraveling, and the current channel in red. And even just looking at their plan form, you can tell a lot of differences, right? The Touchy now is a dominantly single-thread channel. The historic channel, multi-threaded, lots of different channels moving around, and even different features like ponds and beaver ponds, pools, things like that. One thing to also notice and to keep in mind is that these current channels, because of that incision event, they're basically superimposed on the landscape. And you see a lot of the green channels of the historic, or green channels of the historic floodplain kind of disappearing into the modern floodplain. And so that suggests to me that those channels were in that footprint of the incised channel. So you can then assume that this network, like this, probably was in the same footprint as well. And just like we do with current channels, we can use our typical analytical methods and start pulling characteristics of these different reaches. So like this is just showing a center line through all the different polygons of the channels. We can pull lengths from that. We can also look at things like the angle of side channel attack and start pulling out patterns and metrics. We can also do systematic cross-sections or transects to get at widths. And when we compare those, it's not really any kind of surprise that the historic channel, pretty much everything except those two, are higher than the current channel, indicating some level of higher complexity. We use these a lot: total channel length, secondary channel length like side channels, flood channels, the sinuosity, RCI. And comparing the two, we see that complete loss in what the river used to look like and how it used to behave. The two that are lower, though, are also completely justified. That when you look at the plan form, a multi-threaded system versus a dominantly single thread system is going to have a shorter main stem channel length and lower sinuosity because it has that ability to spread flows through multiple channels and connect to the floodplain to dissipate energy, versus a single thread channel is going to have to just primarily use meandering and bank erosion to increase its sinuosity to dissipate energy. A real benefit of this is not just identifying these features and trying to see what things look like in the past. This can also then become your restoration goals and targets, looking at those historic conditions. Because if you are trying to restore, you're trying to return it to something like this. And again, because the current channel is superimposed on the historic floodplain, really a better acquisition or a better target might be a combination of these two metrics if you're trying to actually take over the entire floodplain and give it back to the river. So what that can look like and lead us to is not just identifying targets and visualizing what it could be. This can also provide a template for what your concepts might look like. So with the red channel still over there, the red channel still being the current channel, the green one being the historic channel, we can kind of just visualize sliding this into place. So of course we know that there's all kinds of logistical constraints and boundary constraints that wouldn't allow us to take over every floodplain of every river. But when we do something like this, we have a target and the footprint is close to what the current one is. So this gives some traction to talk to landowners and figure out maybe some type of setback levy scenario that would give more area to the river to achieve a plan form that is more historically relevant. And you can play additional games by kind of copying and pasting some similar features and fill up the space of the modern channel. But ultimately, this is just showing LiDAR getting at some of this. And you saw in the beginning that it's not just LiDAR, this is like a criminal investigation. You're trying to compile all of these lines of evidence. So beyond that, there's contextual information that can help. one thing I didn't show is that certain times of the year with the aerial imagery, you can see pockets of alkali soils, which typically are going to be associated in these semi-arid regions as old beaver ponds or old deep pools. And these are areas that show up in the imagery where the landowner can't grow crops because the soils are too alkaline. But moreover, a huge benefit we have on the Touchy River is that the Lewis and Clark expedition on their return trip walked the majority of the main stem Touchy that we're looking at now. And you look at some of their journal entries, and it paints a very different picture than what we have now on the modern Touchy, but it also supports the narrative that's coming out from the other lines of evidence. So they noted that the branch forked in several places, there's more timber than usual on this creek, and lots of notes about the prevalence of beaver. Then they also noted, too, a full list of the riparian species that they were seeing as they crossed the valley bottom. And all of these, again, they're riparian or riparian-adjacent species, which is very different than the landscape that we have today on the Touchy. And one of my goals with this whole project, it's kind of a pet project on the side that hopefully leads to something for the Touchy River design process. I would like to do this historic channel reconstruction for the whole thing, to document how much is lost and how much more we have to gain back to actually reach true restoration. But where at least I have now for the entire main stem is the historic floodplain compared to the current floodplain. And I can see already in the REM that what we saw in that example site holds true for the majority of this portion of the main stem. And as far as like the many different channels and multi-threaded plan form and additional remarks on the vegetation types as remarked by Lewis and Clark. But if we just look at the extent of the historic floodplain and the current floodplain, we see the tremendous loss here as well, with just a whole lot of green and very little red. And what that amounts to across the entire thing, ultimately, this might even be an underestimate as well because of the way these REMs work, but upwards of around 80% loss in the total amount of floodplain available to this main stem system. So that's not just an 80% loss in floodplain, you're talking an 80% loss in habitat for not just fish, but also other biota. And you think too is like, well, we lost 80–90% of our salmon. Well, they also have lost 80–90% of their habitat. So what's the point? Well, the point is that if the goal of restoration is to return to some previous condition, then we need to know what that previous condition was. And looking at elsewhere for reference sites is not necessarily going to get us there. Mostly what we do is really rehabilitation or creation. We're making things better for sure, but true restoration would be going back to that previous form. So if we can use this lines of evidence-based approach, then we can recreate these site-specific contexts within similar boundary conditions to figure out a real target that reaches more towards that true restoration target. It also allows us to directly quantify restoration goals and targets, like rather than kind of coming up with these semi-arbitrary metrics like 2 pools per mile, like what does that really even mean? We want to recover the processes and recover the ecosystem so that the metrics that we want to see happen naturally. I also would like people to fully acknowledge this period of the grand unraveling, that we lost so much alluvium, so much ability to store water in the landscape, and tons of habitat. And the majority of the degradation that we're trying to overcome really stemmed from this initial incision event. We keep talking about trying to connect the floodplain as a major thing. That's great. It's because of this one event, which happened in different areas over a long period of time. But also, I would like everybody to try and do something like this, because the more that we can document how far we have left to go and get that into rounds and rounds of every report, every design, then we have this body of gray literature to point to how far we need to go. In the case of the Touchy, we can say now we have lost 80% of our floodplain, 80% of our habitat, and this particular design is only going to get us 10 to 20% of it back. And that's fine. That's where we're at right now. But if we know that policy, legislation, and oftentimes public opinion is about 20 years behind the science. So we need to start now, or even 10, 20 years ago, to document this level of evidence so that we can finally get ahead of it and make some big moves and reach true restoration. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Reid. Next up, we have Jared Johnson with Yakima Nation, and he'll be talking about quantifying reach scale geomorphic change.
Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone that stuck around after lunch. My name is Jared Johnson, as Ariel mentioned, and I'm a senior habitat specialist in our Winthrop office, and I work for the Upper Columbia Habitat Restoration Project. First of all, I'd like to thank my colleagues, Christopher Sir and Luke Swan with Interflu for helping with the data collection and analysis and parts of this presentation. I'm going to be sharing some data with you guys from the Upper Twisp River in the Methow watershed. This particular area is near River Mile 17 to 20 on the Twisp River. And in 2022, the Colville Tribe and the Yakima Nation both partnered independently with the Forest Service to do some large-scale helicopter restoration projects. We installed approximately, like combined Yakima Nation and Colville Tribe, installed approximately 3,000 pieces of large wood throughout this 11 miles of the Twisp River, which is a significant increase from the baseline condition. The project areas that I'm going to be talking about today were implemented by the Yakima Nation, and they're located in the Middle Twisp Assessment Unit, which is a high priority for restoration actions supporting recovery of spring chinook and steelhead. The goal of the project initially was to just increase largewood loading to restore some of the natural riverine processes that we weren't seeing taking place in the landscape. We wanted to really use the best available data, so we started looking at the Fox and Bolton research in unmanaged watersheds in Washington State and took a lot of the key piece numbers and restoration recommended volumes to use for our quantities that we put into the Twisp River here. So as Phil mentioned earlier, the hydrology or the hydraulics of the system really determine a lot of the stream bed movement and geomorphic processes that we see within these rivers. So for context, the project here was completed in July of 2022. That following spring freshet was just over a 10-year discharge, which is pretty significant. And the following two springs were fairly disappointing, well below the average annual event. Unfortunately, we collected our data the last week of October, so we missed any change that would have occurred here in early December when we had the atmospheric river and subsequent flooding. So historically, our program has done a pretty good job of monitoring projects, primarily for like structural integrity and habitat unit or structure performance. When we did this project and expanded the scale and the number of structures and quantity of wood to about 3 miles, we really needed to look at another method for evaluating the overall performance. So we developed a strategy to use orthomosaic imagery from drones as well as some oblique imagery to really develop a narrative about what we were seeing on the landscape. And the orthomosaics and the drone footage is fairly compelling when you start looking at pre-project 2020 data and then the most recent November 2025 conditions. But there was this desire to quantify some of the observed change that we were seeing. I can stand there and say, gosh, you won't believe how much sediment degraded right here, but nobody really has any context for like what I'm seeing there or the depth of pools or lateral migration. It's all kind of relevant to what your guys' history is with this specific location. So we wanted to investigate using structure for motion orthogrammetry to develop a new digital surface model that we could use to do some differencing to estimate the volume of recruited material from pools and the floodplain and tributaries, and the quantity that was retained by these large wood structures or the different channel features that retain and hold sediment. So we decided to really look at, so we wanted to identify the specific locations of where we can see these changes, and then this will be used to inform our adaptive management strategy moving forward. Because just because we stuck a bunch of wood out there the first time, one thing that is apparent is that to continue the progress that we're seeing, we're going to need to add additional wood in the future. So I'm going to touch on methodology, and that's really into 3 different tiers of methods. Our data collection method here, it was fairly simple. We set up a RTK GPS, established a control network, identified ground control points throughout the reach that can be seen from the ortho imagery, and then opportunistically surveyed throughout the reaches as well, just to make sure that we could run statistics on our accuracy throughout that new DSM that we're creating. And then the data processing component, we used a software package from Pix4D, and then generally just moved everything into ArcGIS Pro to do all the analysis. In this case, Pix4D is a very simple tool to use, and yeah, I highly recommend it. If you guys want to know more details about that component, ask me later. I feel like I'm going to run out of time here. The data analysis, I guess the important thing to note here is that we basically created these regions of interest that we hand delineated. One of the limitations of structure from motion is that if you can't see it, you don't know what's below it. So you end up with needing to crop out any surface that is obscured by canopy or wood and that type of stuff. So this is probably the most time-consuming component of the analysis, was to actually create these polygons that we can then do differencing from the 2020 LiDAR on. There is likely a interpolation package with ArcPro that you could try and develop a surface underneath some of this wood and canopy, or you could survey that with rovers and GPS. But we didn't do that here just because we wanted to maintain a high level of confidence in our results. So let's talk about our accuracy. And I'm going to compare it to the 2022 LiDAR that the Bureau of Reclamation was so gracious in collecting for basically our whole region. On the ground, so bare surface on gravel bars, we had exceptional accuracy. Really, the mean error was around 1/10, was around 0, and it wasn't projected up or down. So we have fairly high confidence in that. Edge of water, where you could have had overlapping with the water's edge, it was a little bit worse. And then the bed elevation below the water surface, there was quite a bit more error associated with that. We ended up collecting over 700 points throughout these 3 miles of the reach of interest, just to be able to run these statistics to make sure that we had a good understanding of where we were at. And for reference, in that 2022 LiDAR bathymetry, we see similar error associated with it. So I'm finally going to get to some of the results of this work. Again, you can be out on the river bar and you can look and you can see erosion, recruitment of big trees. You can see sediment sorting like you do in the lower right-hand panel there. But really, how do we quantify a lot of that stuff? So we're looking at bed response, so erosion and deposition, and then we're looking at floodplain exchange. So where do we have bank erosion, channel avulsions, which did happen, and where we see floodplain formation, kind of in inset floodplains. So when you look at the whole reach on one slide, it's fairly difficult to see what's going on there. But you do see specific locations where there are both aggradation or deposition of material and erosion. And we did do some summary statistics on the quantities, and surprisingly enough, the War Creek project area, which is upstream of the Eagle Creek fan, which I don't need to get into, but it had a net change of basically 0, which was actually, I think, somewhat unique and surprising. And then the Lower Creek area downstream, we actually see a net loss of about 1,000 cubic yards of material. And that's kind of being affected by an avulsion that's currently in the process of occurring downstream, as well as a large wood structure at the upstream end that is retaining a bunch of sediment, basically robbing that downstream portion of any aggradation. We have a similar thing going on with the Mystery Reach. I'm just gonna run out of time, so I'm gonna move ahead. But I wanted to be able to provide an illustration of what we were talking about out there. So we're looking at site-specific projects here. This is down near the Eagle Creek confluence. We have an aggradation area upstream, so on the face of this large wood structure that's aggraded between 3 and 5 feet. It's storing about 600 cubic yards of material. Likewise, on both margins of the bank downstream, we see that there's scour and pool development, and then in the lee of the structure, the hydraulic lee, we see some more deposition. The panel on the right for both of these examples is the differencing elevations from the DSM that we created and the LiDAR data set. This is the same thing. Well, I wanted to relate this to fish habitat in some way, so I contacted Ben Goodman with the Department of Fish and Wildlife up there in the Methow, who runs the spawning ground survey program for spring Chinook, and he sent over the most recent data for the last 4 years, so just since the project was completed. And my theory or my observations while being out there during August and seeing where fish were spawning suggested that we were seeing a lot of fish use these depositional areas. And the data that he provided really does illustrate a correlation between those deposition areas and the large wood that we installed and the quantity of reds that are found in those areas. The sample size is exceptionally small, and the accuracy on their GPS is really poor, so it's tough to draw any real hard conclusions to that stuff. But I also wanted to look at another metric, which is pool data. So this slide has a whole bunch of words on it that it's just difficult to read, but the bottom line is that the reach assessment that was done in 2015 for this reach had 7.7 reds per mile. Using the DSM that we created, we've now increased that quantity to 22.9. The quantity of large pools, deep pools, moved from 2 to 4. And we did have some decreases in residual pool depth and maximum pool depth because we increased the quantity so much that we just don't have the same, few deep pools. We've got a lot of diversity out there on the landscape. And I also want to point out that we decided to look at the LiDAR analysis. So we did some differencing between the LiDAR surface and the DSM. And, we ended up drawing in longitudinal profiles, and we see a significant deepening where there were pre-existing pools, and then we installed large wood. And that scour is apparently increasing the depth and volume and going to perpetuate the depth and volume of those pools. I think it'd be really interesting to do some pool volume measurements on these, but we didn't necessarily collect the data in the field to be able to do that very efficiently with the DSM. So the takeaways here, I think that there is a lot of application for using structure from motion orthogrammetry for other monitoring projects, especially some of these larger scale projects. I think this is going to be exceptionally useful when we start talking about the adaptive management strategy for this area with the Forest Service, which is the primary landowner here. And there's a wealth of data that's kind of embedded in both the LiDAR and the DEM that we created, and the ortho mosaic, which is very valuable just for illustration purposes, if nothing else. Some of these areas have a lot of wetted width and a lot of channels, and I chose not to illustrate some of the things that went on in this particular area because it made for very complicated slides. But if you guys have any questions, please find me afterwards. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And last speaker for this session, please welcome Jose Vazquez with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He'll be talking a little bit about the expansion of brook trout and some of our side channel habitat.
Hey, can everyone hear me? Yeah. Okay, I've got a case of laryngitis right now, so if my voice kicks out halfway through, it might not be the mic. But hopefully, we'll be talking today about brook trout red observations in the Eniot River during my office's bull trout spawning ground surveys up there. Okay, so first we're going to start off with a real quick introduction to Eniot River bull trout. It's one of two populations in the Eniot Basin, and it's a highly migratory basin that usually spawns and rears in the area between Eniot Falls and Box Canyon. And Tracy talked about this population yesterday. It's a small population that's susceptible to extirpation. It averages about 20 reds per year, but that's been a declining trend, and we are down to single digits, 7 reds last year in 2025. Okay, and we have that data from red surveys that my office has been doing for over 20 years now. And we've been covering the area between Box Canyon and Eniot Falls. And these are red surveys, so they've had pretty straightforward objectives. Our primary objective has been to monitor any river bull trout spawning activity, but we've had a secondary objective of quantifying any other fall spawning salmonids spawning activity that's up there. So that's Chinook, coho actually, and brook trout. And so with this group, I'm not going to talk too much about red survey methods. You guys are familiar with them, but there are some nuances to brook trout red survey quantification that we do need to talk about. And so first and foremost, our surveys, all observations of resident reds are made by expert observers, and they're made on a weekly basis generally. And by expert observers, they usually have to be people that have at least 1 year of resident survey experience, preferably a couple years in the Eniot by the time that they're actually out there alone. And we do this because brook trout reds are really difficult to identify and quantify. Notoriously, they can be really small. So when you start seeing a lot of brook trout, they can actually start spawning at as small as 10 centimeters, so about 4 inches. At that point, you're talking about a red that's about the size of a saucer. A giant brook trout red is usually like dish plate size. So these things are pretty tiny. They have short red lives. Also, females can often make multiple reds per female. They love digging test reds, which makes things really messy. And probably worst of all, they have extremely high superimposition rates. So what this ends up being is that at each spawning location, surveyors usually estimate the maximum and the minimum number of reds at the location. It's pretty easy when there's a single red, but when they start spawning on top of each other, that can get kind of hard. And the image that you see there is actually a good example. So it's about 1.5 meters long, I think about 40 centimeters wide. And over the course of 7 weeks, we saw 8 different females building little saucer reds on that location. And we ended up estimating there were probably about 7 to 12 reds there total during the course of the season based on prior experience, quantifying that over time. All of that is to say that these results, they end up being an approximation of spawning activity, kind of think of them like steelhead surveys to a certain extent. They do reflect total spawning activity, but the absolute numbers, there's a little bit of wiggle room in there. So keep that in mind when we get to the next slide, which has results. Okay, and just a quick introduction of the graph before we start talking about it. So this is annual number of brook trout reds. The black bar is the minimum number that I mentioned earlier, whereas that gray bar is the maximum. That y-axis is correct. I'm going to talk to that in a second. So for the first 16 years or so of these surveys, we weren't seeing much brook trout spawning activity. We were usually getting 0 to 8 reds per year. That's not to say that there weren't any brook trout spawning within the reaches during that time. It's just that there probably weren't very many. Again, these things can be really small, so they can look like a footprint when you're doing surveys, and there aren't that many of them. It's not until you start seeing a lot of spawning that you typically notice that they're there and, you know, enough to be able to count. And so that started happening around 2021, where we started seeing 18 and then 50 reds in 2022. We noticed this was a trend. We were a little bit concerned about it. But then in 2023, we saw almost 300 to 600 reds. Then in 2024, we were up to almost 400 to 800. And this past year was pretty crazy. We saw almost 700 to 1,500, which is, to be frank, a fairly insane number of reds. So I have talked following all of this, we were concerned about the data. I've talked to people in Montana, Idaho, Western Washington, Oregon, Alberta, Quebec, Maine, and Pennsylvania at this point about these results. And bottom line is that we might have seen the most reds that have been documented during brook trout red surveys, but these results might not be unprecedented. So Quebec has seen really high densities of brook trout within certain streams that were kind of perfect for brook trout and didn't have any non-natives in them. They weren't quite our densities, but they were pretty high. And then talking to other surveyors in the West, so where brook trout are not native, they're generally not quantified during red surveys. I mean, as I was getting to earlier, it's really hard to count these things. You have to be going at least weekly, preferably more. You have to be really familiar with the reach and be able to count them. From other bull trout surveyors, they're starting to see a lot of sand and gravel piles where brook trout are congregating. They're seeing that throughout the spawning season. So there's thoughts that they might be seeing some of this too. It's just going uncounted at this point. So this is probably not a problem that is specific to our area. Okay, so let's get back to this data and let's talk about the where and the why of it. So as far as where are these reds being built, so most of the brook trouts were found in a series of side channels known as Silver Falls Creek Confluence. And these side channels are a mix of natural and restored side channels. And several of the channels were reconnected by high flows that we think happened in 2022 or during the 2023 Silver Falls Enhancement Project. And so I think the best way to kind of conceptualize this data is to take a look at a zoomed in map of the Silver Falls area. So this is a satellite image of that area. And, and this is the 2025 results. And you can see where within that area between Box Canyon and Eniot Falls we are right there with that red arrow. And then those blue dots correspond to locations of brook trout reds. So the smallest dots are a single red. The biggest dot on there is a pool where we saw about 40 to 80 brook trout reds. Okay, so about 67% to 80% on average of the reds have been found within the single 400-meter side channel that we think naturally reconnected in 2022. There was some wood that was dropped in there during habitat restoration. We do find brook trout reds around that area, but honestly, you can see on the map, we kind of find them dispersed throughout the entire channel. So a lot of these reds we believe would be there or are probably caused by that natural reconnection and would be there regardless of any restoration. So for the restoration folks in the room though, these two side channels up here are excavated side channels, and frankly those reds, they definitely would not be there if not for the excavation. It would be dry. Based on brook trout life histories, they probably wouldn't be there, wouldn't exist within this area period if it wasn't for that. So this is a bit of a yes, side channels can lead to red construction. But we are finding natural channels too where we're seeing really high numbers of reds. This channel was always connected and we have been noticing more and more reds as time's been going on. And I'll get into this in a little more detail in a sec, but some of those, there are a couple side channels further upstream where we hadn't seen brook trout reds before, but this year with the historic low flows, historic high temperatures, we were seeing reds up there as well. And we also saw this year too, is that this was the first year we saw a substantial amount of reds within the main channel. My guess is that we were seeing really low flows this year, so the habitat was probably a little more accessible. And also, as brook trout start to reach carrying capacity within their streams, they're known for pushing out. So these might be some fish that are coming out as we're reaching these very high densities within the side channels. Okay, so this next question brought up from this is, why are these counts suddenly so high? Well, there's a lot of literature out there that shows that brook trout thrive in 12 to 16 seawater that's low gradient, low velocity, complex, narrow, and has small substrate sizes. And so the increasing stream temperatures were about 1 to 2 C in this portion of the Eniot, and the reconnection are causing areas such as the Silver Falls side channel to meet this criteria. So previously, most of these areas were too cold or they were unconnected, and something that's kind of helped this point, or add some evidence to this point, is that spawning has also been occurring in those upstream areas, like I said, during the historic low flows and high temperatures. We'd never seen it up there, but this year, as that area was getting to be around 14 to 16 C in some cases, we were starting to see brook trout spawn in that area for the first time. Okay, this begs the question, so why are brook trout a concern? So for bull trout, brook trout can outcompete them as juvenile bull trout, and they can also hybridize with spawning adults. So there's some work out of Idaho that showed recently that densities as low as 2 to 7 brook trout per 100-meter reach can lead to extirpation of some bull trout life histories. And it's very well documented that competition increases exponentially when temperatures are above 12°C, and as these reaches are warming, that is becoming more and more of a concern. But brook trout aren't just a concern for bull trout. They're also a concern for other native salmonids. So for cutthroat, there's just a wealth of data that shows that brook trout can outcompete cutthroat within their native range. If you're interested in that, just a quick Google Scholar search will bring you more than you'll have time to read in a day. It's a little more complicated for other species. So for Chinook, paper Levin et al. 2002 found reduced survival and growth when brook trout were present in general throughout their range. However, there was variation. There have been some areas where Chinook can outcompete brook trout, but there are other areas where some of the habitat factors there can lead to brook trout outcompetition. Micas is particularly complicated. There's not a lot of published data out there, and what is out there has shown that when gradients are fairly high, Micas, when they're usually in rainbow form, can outcompete brook trout. However, there's not a lot of published literature on some of the low gradient areas like what I'm talking about today. But there is a lot of agency data out there. So some of the data from my office, from Western Washington, and from Idaho has often recorded brook trout monocultures when you get kind of that sweet spot of 12 to 16°C, complex, low gradient, fairly narrow. And again, it's just, I've been in too many spots where you stick your head in the water and it's just brook trout. It is perspective changing when you see those kind of things. So there are areas where we believe that that brook trout can outcompete brook trout within this area. All right, so conclusions. Now I want to get into what conclusions we can and can't draw from this data. So first, let's talk about what the data does not indicate. So it does not indicate that habitat restoration is directly responsible for all increased local brook trout spawning in the upper Enya River. Again, over 80% of brook trout reds were observed in naturally reconnected or unaltered habitat. The data also does not indicate that all natural or reconstructed side channels in mid-Columbia can or will increase brook trout populations. This is monitoring data from one location. It probably is applicable to a few other systems like areas of the Chihuahua, the White River, some areas in the Methow, but it's not broadly applicable to everywhere. Conditions are going to vary between locations, right? Flow, temperature, complexity, all of that. And then also, source populations are not present everywhere for brook trout, right? Like I was personally this year in an area at a habitat restoration site, which would have been just absolutely perfect for brook trout, but there wasn't a source population of brook trout within that area. So when we were doing the snorkels, just, you know, the native assemblage that you wanted to see following restoration. All right. Now let's talk about what the data does indicate. So it does indicate, I mean, this one's kind of implicit. Brook trout are spawning at very high densities within side channel habitat in the Enya River in bull trout spawning regions, right? It also indicates that perennial side channels can support large levels of brook trout spawning and potentially rearing under conditions present in mid-Columbia rearing habitat. And again, this is a concern where brook trout are present and side channels offer perennial habitat that is relatively small, low gradient, that 12 to 16°C window, and complex with fine substrate. And then this was a map that was in Tracy's presentation yesterday, and this shows all of the bull trout spawning areas in the mid-Columbia, and a lot of those areas do meet that criteria, at least they have side channels that do. And you know, a lot of those areas are warming to meet that 12 to 16.3 threshold, and about 2/3 of these spots do have brook trout within them. So this is a concern in a lot of the areas where bull trout are located. All right, and then also, again, this isn't only a bull trout concern. Brook trout can outcompete most native species in the conditions that I just mentioned. So this is something to think about when we're thinking about where we're putting habitat restoration projects and where there are brook trout populations. All right, and I think I still have some time, right? Okay, so I always get questions about removal and suppression options. So we're gonna go ahead and talk about that real fast. All right, and the first question I get is, can brook trout be removed from the Enya River? And unfortunately, the answer is probably not, or at least not easily. The Enya River and a lot of other systems like it are too large and complex for most removal methods to be feasible. So these are some pictures from the area around Silver Falls that we're talking about. And I mean, anyone who's ever done electrofishing removal for brook trout will kind of look at this and see, I mean, it's really deep in some sections, and that is a lot of wood. You're just not going to be able to remove everything, and brook trout are notoriously good at bouncing back from almost complete obliteration. Also, the presence of listed species make rote known and YY introductions and some other tools in our toolbox extremely difficult to implement. And then large brook trout source populations can also complicate things, right? Even if you were able to remove everything from these areas, let's see, yeah. So we've just been talking about this little section up here. We've actually, the Silver Falls area is only a portion of that little orange line. There's another 15 kilometers of fairly complex habitat where brook trout are up there. Removing everything from that location with current tools where there were listed species is just realistically probably not feasible. What about suppression, though, if we can't do removal? Possibly. Suppression is possible, but the effectiveness, feasibility, and long-term sustainability is debatable, right? Potential issues that we're all familiar with are recolonization. Sustained funding for these projects can be very difficult, right? You pretty much can't stop once you start. Complex habitat, again, can make removal very difficult. And then there's also the listed species impacts. Can you indefinitely be electrofishing where there are steelhead, chinook, and bull trout? And then, but that said though, there have been some successes reported. Gill netting in lakes within Oregon has been working out pretty well recently. And also electrofishing small streams, there is a long history of that being successful for suppression and sometimes removal. All right, the bottom line from all of this though is that prevention is really critical in sensitive habitat. In general, it's best to just try to avoid introducing or augmenting brook trout populations when possible. Once you let the brook trout genie out of the bottle, it is really hard to put it back in. All right, and with that, I'm just going to acknowledge, I mean, this has been a 21-year data set. There have been a lot of people that have been involved in over the years, so I just want to thank everyone on this and more for all the hard work. And if I don't have a picture up here, it just means you weren't photogenic enough to get up. I apologize, but if you send me a nice one, maybe next time. All right.
All right, thanks everyone. Can we get our speakers back up for our Q&A, please? And if you have a question, raise your hand and we can get a microphone to you.
I have a question for Jose. So in the Entiat, you got a declining bull trout population. You have an increasing brook trout population. It does seem like the future is already written for those fish. But in lieu of just watching them blink out, bull trout, what about recognizing that most of the brook trout population is spawning in these side channels? Have you considered about basically dewatering those while the eggs are incubating? I mean, it's low flow. You know, we do a lot of this when we're doing fish removal prior to a habitat restoration project, right? You put some sandbags out, some visqueen, divert the water away from that area that you're going to do a habitat restoration project, do it, and then reconnect the channel. You could do the same, or is it possible that you could be effective doing the same thing, dewatering the side channel for a period of time, wouldn't have to be for a long time, a couple of weeks, desiccate the reds, and then reactivate it?
Yeah, that's a good question, Christian. I think my response would be that I think we probably do need to start thinking outside of the box when it comes to responses to this, right? Like, I'll say our agency is historically been kind of had our hands tied as far as like what we're able to do in response to that. Like that, I mean, like the alarm bells for that in the past would have been like, okay, well, you're going to be blocking off this side channel that has listed species in it during the spawning season, right? So what does that mean from a permitting nexus, from an implication nexus and all that? But I mean, this is an extraordinary amount of reds, right? So maybe we need to start thinking about that and how we can minimize the impact from actions like that. And yeah, it's that particular response has been something we're talking about. It isn't going to be an easy lift, but if we're going to save the population when we're talking about these kind of numbers of bull trout and brook trout respectively, that might be something we need to consider.
Just a follow-up to that is, there may be listed species in the side channel, but they may get the cue to leave, right, if it starts dewatering. but the eggs aren't going anywhere, right?
Yeah.
So.
Question for Jose. Did you, those are seeing such a incredible, so 2 questions. One, with the big jump from like 50 to hundreds of reds, did you see any kind of environmental influences that kind of drove that huge increase, like some water temperature stuff or flow stuff that kind of cranked that number up? And then coincident with that, during your observations on the bull trout reds, did you see increased brook trout presence in and around the bull trout reds, kind of getting to like, is all of this increasing the potential for hybridization?
Okay, that's a good question. I think yes is the simple answer to all of that, but to break it down. Okay, so if I wasn't clear, I apologize, but like we think that the reason why all of those reds were within side channels, right? And most of those side channels were not connected either because of natural or reconstruction reasons prior to 2022. So that's part of it, is that the habitat just wasn't there, right? But following reconnection, so I think that, and I'm having to go from memory here on flows, somebody probably can correct me, but 2023 wasn't that abnormal compared to some recent years. But last year was extremely abnormal, right? And we did see that huge jump, and again, we saw fish that were in the main stem, I think, just being very familiar with that reach, partially because they were able to access some off-channel units that would normally be flowing in too fast they wouldn't go into. To your other question, and forgive me if I forgot something, but to your other question about just have we seen more brook trout within the main channel? Yes, most definitely. And we were hoping to actually go in there and quantify that this year with some snorkel surveys, but all of the fires kept us from being able to go in. We're hoping to go in next year. But I'll just say that like it used to be that when we were walking around, I would see a lot of micus, I would see some bull trout every now and then. I almost only see brook trout now in the lower Aniot. I mean, there probably are still micus out there. Again, we need to go in, we need to snorkel and get some actual real data. But like just the anecdotal when we're doing surveys, like I cannot believe the amount of young of the year and age 1 brook trout that I'm seeing. It has been insane, just hundreds sometimes when you're walking around.
This question's for Jose. It seems like there's a lot of overlap with the habitat suitability characteristics for brook trout and juvenile salmonids, particularly in the off-channel habitat. My question is, you didn't really cover any policy-related implications, but are there conversations happening between the service and the department on management of an introduced game fish species and the impacts it might be having to listed fish?
Yeah, and these discussions are kind of coming up more and more right now because of results like this, right? And as temperatures are increasing, brook trout are becoming a problem within areas that were the bull trout strongholds. I think that is a concern. I'd have to bring up, I'm not one of the policy folks, so I'd have to bring up one of them to give like specific examples about things. I'll just say that we have been talking to like WFW about take on brook trout within bull trout habitat and how that works. It is a complicated thing though, just because again, as you start using these methods that are targeting brook trout, a lot of times they're also going to be collecting from your listed species, and so that is an added complication, right? So it's a long talk, and I would, if you're interested, I can direct you to some policy folks who probably give you a better answer.
Yeah, I had a question about the YY brook trout and how that could apply or not work or whatever.
Yeah, so YY brook trout are really complicated. Okay, I guess our first problem, or the first complication with YY brook trout within this area is that YY brook trout to date actually, and this might have changed in the past year or two, but last time I was talking to the YY folks, they are still not using them within bull trout areas because there are concerns about as you have to stock large amounts of YY brook trout into an area following your initial brook trout removal. So there are concerns, what does that mean for your bull trout population as you start stocking in them, stocking those non-natives in there? There are thoughts, okay, well maybe we can pull out the bull trout beforehand. That's been discussed, but that is its own, where are you going to put them? You have to find the hatchery. Again, it gets very logistically complicated, and because YY is still kind of an unproven technique with some other concerns I'm not even getting at, they've just kind of held back from doing that within these kind of areas. There's also, and there's the overarching question on YY brook trout too. Like, we hope that it's going to be a good tool in the toolbox, but we're still at the point where we haven't yet shown that it can completely knock out the brook trout population. It's gotten them down to like 2% of what they were historically, but brook trout can come back from 2%. So once it's a proven technique, once we can show that it can just get rid of something, I think that we'll start talking about it within these areas. But I think we're looking at other tools before YY just because of everything that goes along with it right now. Any question for these two?
Another question for Jose. So question's twofold. First is, did you do any substrate size sampling or measurements for the within that period? And then second, if there was possibly some change in substrate size that could possibly be related to some of the recent fires with additional vines?
No, we're starting to get into the limitations of these being red surveys and us being busy with other projects. We haven't done any official substrate observations. I mean, if I took any of you out there, you can look at it. I mean, I honestly, before this, didn't know that brook trout could spawn in sand. Apparently they can spawn in sand because we see it all the time. It's very obvious that these are very small substrates that they are able to use. And again, you can eyeball it when you're out there. You're seeing bull trout and Chinook and coho spawn in, the traditional gravel, into cobble even, whereas the brook trout are in things that are sand in some cases, or at best pea gravel. But yeah, it would be nice to get some, there's a lot of areas, and someone's gonna ask the camera question at some point too. Like, there's a lot of data we'd like to collect on this that we just don't have time to. If anyone has a master's student who's interested in this, please send them my way. But yeah, there are pieces that we'd like to gather that maybe if there's time eventually.
I'll ask one not for Jose, it's for Reid. In the context of like changing hydrology and the hydrograph, and let's say you do a restoration project along the lines of what you're suggesting, does it matter that we have like a longer period of reduced base flows, that we have big events like what we just experienced with the atmospheric river? And I guess, does any of that matter if you do a project and upstream and downstream from that project, it's still an incised single thread channel?
Yeah, that question should have been on everybody's mind, because that's obviously what we have challenges with in any kind of floodplain reconnection, stage 0, multi-thread channel conversion project, is that we are operating under several different boundary conditions than we had during the earlier Holocene. We, of course, have the hockey stick graph of climate change, and so things are different. But if you even go back 20 years, climate records are pretty consistent through that time. So we have this discrepancy of non-stationary norms in the last several decades. But if any of you have been to a spot that beavers have reclaimed and really taken over, you can see what it can do in that spot where they've taken over, raised the accumulated alluvium, raised the channel bed, re-wetted the entire floodplain, even though it's up and still incised upstream and downstream. So similar to stage 0 guidance, you need to have some consistent downstream geomorphic control that can hold that amount of sediment and also provide backwatering effects. But it is amazing what rivers can do when you give them that kind of opportunity. So I know we're all afraid to do it, but the more that we do it, the more comfortable we'll get, right? It wasn't that long ago where all we were doing is log weirs, and now we're dropping helicopter wood. We're doing all kinds of crazy stuff. So time will come when we figure all those things out. And it's not like you would take a concept like that, hand it off to an engineer and say, go build this. There's still gonna be the process of feasibility and logistical constraints and trying to figure out how now can we implement it and maximize the amount of recovery in any given reach.
Over here.
This is another question for Reid. I think a lot of people are have for a while been realizing the importance of floodplains. I don't think that's super new. I guess what I'm trying to understand is it almost seems a bit like a paradigm shift in taking it another step in quantifying the amount of historical floodplain that existed not that long ago. Have you seen, is your work fairly new on quantifying? Have you seen a lot of literature out there that sort of does that kind of, we haven't restored the 90% of our floodplains, and no surprise, we haven't seen the shift we've wanted in salmon recovery. Is there a lot of research showing this, or are you on the more so front edge of it?
I don't think front edge by any means. Luna Leopold, Wallman, and Miller have a great textbook from '64 that they describe some of the stuff related to the Grand Unraveling. I'm trying to put a name to this event to separate it from the Anthropocene and any other conversations around human disturbance that is specific to this incision event that led to the disconnection of floodplains. And there is tons of literature still describing what has happened, the amount of loss, the amount of degradation, and then of course the effects on fish and how great it would be to get back to it. I think the bottom line in knowing what it is that fish need a lot of things, but first and foremost, they need space. They need the amount of water to go and live in. Otherwise, that's going to be your ultimate carrying capacity limit. You can throw as much food at them as you want if they don't have the space to live and grow. So if we're trying to, again, come to this kind of true restoration, trying to achieve millions of salmon coming back, we not only have to offset all of the out-of-basin effects in all of our tributaries, but we have to potentially go above and beyond in our freshwater habitats, if not just go back to true restoration, so that we can give them the space to do what they can in the freshwater, right? So I think there's a lot more to come out of this. A big change from the era of Leopold, Wallman, Miller, all of that, is the technical capacity. Computer systems are much more powerful. LiDAR is readily available. Pretty much all of Washington is covered with at least one LiDAR data set now. So you could feasibly do any of this type of research with Amazon Web Services or a powerful computer. And I know lots of folks are doing it in local capacities, and there's a couple instances like the Columbia River Basin, we're trying to map the entire floodplain. So I don't know about being on the front end by any mean, but I definitely have a passion for it, so I'm going to continue to harp on it.
All right, thank you, everybody. With that, can we give a round of applause to our speakers? And finally, I'd like to welcome Shannon Adams, our UCSRB board chair, to give us some final closing remarks.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks to all the presenters. It's not easy for scientists to present to scientists, that's for sure. So I appreciate you getting up here and presenting your work that you've done. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Shannon Adams, and I am an enrolled member of the Yakima Nation, and I'm currently serving as the Yakima Nation Fisheries Resource Management Technical Service Coordinator. So I'm guiding policy with the 4 H's: habitat, harvest, hydro, and hatcheries. My background is in 25 years of habitat restoration projects on the Yakima Reservation, which now what I do is office work and policy meetings and things like that. So I don't get to do the fun stuff like these bio folks get to do anymore. So I know we've been talking a lot about honoring the past here, and I kind of wanted to start with a video, kind of like a feel-good video. Like this project took like 80 years to accomplish. So I'm going to go to, if we could show the video on Bateman Island here, because we did do groundbreaking work there, starting to remove a causeway that was put in there in 1940 to, my understanding is for agricultural reasons and to access an area. So basically what they did was disrupt the flow of the Yakima River, which caused huge problems there. And we didn't know if we were going to get that done. And I know that's probably a lot of folks' challenges right now with this new administration is the funding. We thought the funding would have been cut and things wouldn't have happened and we wouldn't have got to the groundbreaking results that we did. So we did start removal of that. Okay, so here is Bateman Island Causeway right here. And as you can see, that island was built there just to go across. And I hear just put cattle over there on that island over there. And there's a lot of Native American artifacts on that island, and I think people used it to trail and all kinds of other kind of stuff. But what that had caused was water heating in that area. It caused basses and caused a lot of predation going on there. So this side channel, or causeway, was not flowing freely. They began work, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, and they are going to have that completely removed in February 2026 is what they said. We'll see if that happens, because sometimes with habitat projects, they don't sometimes meet the deadline that we anticipate for, but we stick it out. And it's because, you know, of folks like us and you guys that with the data and the science that get us to these points where we can do these kind of changes and adjustments. And it goes the same with like dam removal or in-low dams and all these small diversions that we aren't no longer using anymore. So this happened way before my lifetime. And I can only imagine the people, my ancestors who fought to not put this in the first place, but also fought to remove this. And I would hope, or I would have wished that some of them would look at it now and seeing that it is finally being removed. So there it goes. This is one of the big projects that the Yakima Nation was able to accomplish this year. So 2026 for us is looking pretty great for right now. So this is gonna hopefully improve some of the salmonids within this watershed. Yakima, the lower Yakima has some water issues. It's got some stargrass, and this also has created some algae blooms, is my understanding too as well. So this should be a little bit of a motivator for you guys to keep your good work going and keep the science going, and eventually we will get there to some of all the issues that are challenged in the Upper Columbia Salmon Recovery, or the Columbia River. That's what I'm trying to say, I guess. So it is freely flowing. It's going to be freely flowing end of February, I believe, is what they were saying. So let's go on to the next project. Don't want to lose momentum here, because sometimes it's really hard to keep the momentum here and keeping our work going, because it's just like, why are we doing this, you know? And I appreciate you guys all sitting here in this cold. Shows your true dedication here. Here's another project here. This is on the headwaters of Toppenish Creek, which is the headwaters of the Yakima River, and contains steelhead habitat. And this project is on the end of an alluvial fan. And basically in 1970, the day in 1969 is when I was born, a big flood came in 1970 and flooded out the whole town of White Swan. So what is our immediate reaction to do when these occurrences come? We go out there, we build a 1 mile dike that basically pushed this whole, decimated the whole alluvial fan, pushed the creek to the south, and made it into just basically a channel. So in 2012, I did a reach assessment in this area, and this was identified as one of the limiting factors here. So in 2018, due to funding, lack of funding, we broke it down in phases. Sometimes you have to make it work or try to figure out how to make it work. So in phase 1 in 2018, we removed 0.5 miles of a dike. And then in 2000, and right there, you're looking at the phase 1. So restoration takes a while for that vegetation. It took about 7 to 8 years for it to get to where it's at. And so in 2025, through many challenges, because it takes people time to get the concept to change their minds on things and to understand things. So you just got to keep harping at it and keep going forward and moving forward and trying to make things work. So in 2025, we went out there and had the funding available. We also had to save money too as well, and funding sources to get these projects, because these restoration projects are not cheap by any means. And so in 2025, we removed the remainder 0.5 miles, and this is the remaining dike that we removed in 2025 last year. So this project is finally complete, and that alluvial fan is now free to meander as it would like, historically does. And the river always remembers and wants to be a river again and flow naturally where normally is. But when we dried up this aquifer and when we did these kind of things, I don't think we ever think about what the consequences are going to be in the future. And what had happened when we did decimate this aquifer here, or this cut off this alluvial fan, some of the wells in the White Swan area of folks started going dry. We've done some other measures to try to improve that, trying to release flow and trying to recharge that aquifer up through other means besides, letting that flow completely free. So that was another kind of feel-good project that we was able to complete. So change is possible, and you can do it. We just got to keep on moving forward and striving forward. So that was another project. So this is something that all your guys' works compiled to help us get these kind of projects accomplished. So I appreciate everybody's work on doing this and keeping at it, and we will eventually hopefully get there. And I probably enticed you guys to ask more questions than to like, oh yeah, this is great, but no question. So with that, ending comments, I went through different speeches, so you guys are just gonna have to listen to it, okay? So here we go. So what is the theme of the Science Summit? Honoring the past and shaping our future. I'm not sure what that means to everyone in this room, but to the Yakama Nation, our guiding motto has always been, make it like it was. We all know we can never fully return the rivers to the way our ancestors knew them, but we can honor that vision by doing everything in our power to honor, protect, restore, and improve conditions. For salmonins, lamprey, sturgeon, and all at-risk species. And when I say all at-risk species, I don't just mean in the rivers or the oceans. I mean the wildlife, the sacred foods, the roots, huckleberries, everything that sustains our Yakama people and you guys. The Yakama Nation will continue to fight for all the beings we cannot speak for themselves. That's another thing we gotta do. These species cannot speak for themselves, so we gotta do what we can for them. Historically, the Columbia River saw more than 10 million salmon returning every year. Today, we're closer to 2 million. That decline says everything about the state of the ecosystem right now. It should be very alarming to all of us. It is certainly alarming to the Yakama people who have fought many generations, who have gone to jail to keep these species alive. To understand where we're going, we have to look honestly at where we've been. When settlers arrived, we built infrastructures and communities around aesthetics and convenience. We did not learn to coexist with the ecosystem. We reshaped it to suit ourselves. So historically, we removed large wood from streams. We removed all the large wood. Now we're putting it all back in. We built levees to protect our infrastructures. We're taking them out now. We put roads and cities right next to rivers. We trapped beaver, built dams, blocked side channels, and dewatered streams, just to name a few. All of our lives are easier, but we never thought about how the lives are going to be harder for the salmon, wildlife, the first foods, water, our air. So one time I was in a board meeting, and I was asked once, what does recovery mean to me? That is a pretty loaded question. I ask the same question to you. What does recovery mean to you? Well, recovery to me is not a single outcome or a box we check. Recovery is a relationship. It is an ongoing work repairing what was broken ecologically, culturally, and institutionally. So the river, the salmon, and the people who depend on them can thrive again. Recovery means returning power, natural processes disrupted by human decisions. It means recognizing that the river knows how to heal if we stop getting in its way. Like I said, the river remembers. It wants to go back to its natural system. Recovery means honoring the teachings of my ancestors who understood that our well-being is inseparable from the well-being of fish, the water, and the land. It means carrying forward the responsibility to protect the species that cannot speak for themselves. Recovery means working across boundaries, jurisdictional, cultural, political, and institutional, because salmon do not recognize those lines, and neither should our solutions. Recovery means patience and persistence. Real change takes decades, not grant cycles. It means celebrating progress when it's slow and refusing to give up when the work feels overwhelming. Recovery means listening to the land, letting the river move, letting wood fall, letting beaver build, letting floodplains breathe, letting natural systems reclaim the roles they evolved to play. Recovery means adaptive management, not as bureaucratic requirements, but as mindset, learning, adjusting, improving, and staying humble, enough to admit when something isn't working. Recovery means resilience, the kind my people have carried for generations. The resilience to keep fighting for salmon, for water, and for the future, even when the odds are steep, and they have been steep. Recovery means hope backed by action, not hope as a feeling, but hope as a responsibility. Recovery isn't fast. Change is scary, change is hard, but if we give up, these species will go extinct, and future generations will only read about them in history books. I am truly grateful for the Yakama Nation Fisheries Resource Management had such a really strong team dedicated to the Yakama Nation goals. I want to thank you all, and thank you to everyone in this room. Your work makes these changes possible. There's still much to do though, you guys, but your commitment gives us momentum. So I'll leave you with this. Don't give up, keep pushing forward, stay on the right side of history, have faith, have hope. On behalf of the Upper Columbia Salmon Recovery Board and myself, thank you for your work you do, and safe travels home, folks.
All right, thanks everyone. You are free to go. Thanks for sticking around. I hope you found something valuable from all of that today. Quick reminder to return your lanyard and name tag in the basket as you leave, and take some snacks for the road. And do the feedback survey. The QR code is on the tables. Thank you.